Hello, everybody, and welcome once again to the Watch Club. We are a monthly filmmaker interview production of the Newburyport Documentary Film Festival. I am program director James Sullivan. I'm very happy today to talk a little bit about the new documentary, The Blues Society, made by Dr. Augusta Palmer. And we have Dr. Palmer here with us in the studio, and we will talk to her in just a moment. But what we'd like to do, so the Blues Society is a film. If you've seen The Summer of Soul, the Academy Award winning documentary from a year or so, 2 years ago, I think. It's a similar study of a music festival that took place in the late 1960s, in this case in Memphis, Tennessee. It's called the Memphis Country Blues Festival. And Dr. Palmer got her hands on some incredible footage from this festival and has created a really sweet and really nicely done documentary on some of these classic country blues performers. So let's take a quick look at the trailer for the Blues Society, and then I will introduce Dr. Palmer, the director.
Memphis and this area has a rich musical heritage. This city has one of the richest histories of any music city in the world.
These men were geniuses. They were American heroes.
A great big hand for the Wildcats.
Between that hash and my $65, we put on the first Memphis Country Blues Festival.
And people came from Europe, from all over the country.
Mick Jagger wants to talk to you on the telephone. The Goodyear blimp was coming overhead and PBS was filming.
Just before the festival, an Imperial Grand Wizard from the Ku Klux Klan held a rally.
One of my great uncles was actually killed by a white man. These things are very real to me.
We loved this music and we went there to promote this music.
There is always a disconnect in the deep context of the music, which is violence and pain and hurt.
In 1969, it would be difficult to maintain that melancholia and the ability to express it musically is the exclusive property of the black man.
It's ours. It's ours. It's our legacy.
Dr. Augusta Palmer, welcome to the Watch Club.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
So why don't you explain, first of all, if you can, your connection to this material in this story?
Sure. Well, in a way, I went to one of these blues festivals in 1969. Both my parents were involved in organizing the festivals, and my mother was pregnant with me in 1969 when she was taking tickets at the festival, and then got called on to give an impromptu speech when people weren't paying for their tickets and kind of like pushing through the gates and trying to get in for free. So I was kind of there. But anyway, the real connection is that my parents were involved. Yeah.
You were basically a bouncer, part of the bouncer team, right? for the people who were trying to sneak in without paying, right?
Yes.
Did you, because you were in the womb at the Blues Festival, did you grow up loving this music?
Well, I didn't really because my parents split up when I was very young, like only a few months old, and I didn't actually really get to know my dad at all until I was a teenager. And so, so my mom was not a blues fan. She cared very much about the people who made the blues in this festival, because she really thought they were amazing human beings. But it wasn't her musical cup of tea, strangely enough. So yeah, I didn't really grow up with it and didn't get to know this music until, in my 20s or something, or maybe even later.
Did you and your mother stay in Memphis, though?
My mother and I stayed in Little Rock, which is where both my parents were from. So that's where I grew up, Little Rock, Arkansas. Yeah.
Right. And your father, just to be clear for anyone watching who's not familiar, was Robert Palmer, who wrote many books about popular music and the blues in particular, and was a music critic and writer for the New York Times for years, among other places, right?
Yeah, definitely. And Rolling Stone and Spin for a minute, and
Right. So I started to ask you this a few minutes ago before we went live, but do you want to explain the story about how the footage came? This footage is fantastic, obviously. And you have been, you told me that you've been thinking about and talking to other folks, including Nancy Jeffries, who was in a band with your father in that time, and also another one of the organizers, about making this film for years, right? So where did the archival footage of the annual festival come from, and how did it come about that you're the one who got to make the film?
Right. Well, the footage came from two places. So there's footage, and there's only footage actually of the 1969 festival, even though my film tells the story of the full arc of the festival, which was like 66 to 70.
Yeah.
So 1969 was shot by WNET, which is a PBS affiliate in New York, and they had a show called The Sounds of Summer, hosted by Steve Allen, and so they shot the festival.
Oh, Steve Allen was the host. That's where the Steve Allen. He was the
that's
host.
Where Steve Allen comes from.
Okay.
He was the host, and a lot of the things that were featured on that show were things like like Tanglewood or something like that. But they decided to send a crew to the Memphis Country Blues Festival and film it in 1969, and then they made like a 2.5 hour show featuring a lot of performances from that. So there was that, but at the same time, the organizers of the festival had made a deal with Gene Rosenthal, who had a label called Adelphi Records and was interested in doing music films as well. And so he brought a crew of 5 down to shoot this beautiful 16 millimeter footage, which you see in the film. But when he got there, he wasn't expecting that Channel 13 crew to be there.
Oh.
So he felt that his footage really wasn't marketable because it was kind of already out there.
Yeah.
I guess, in a way, he didn't know that it was going to air on PBS and then be put in a vault and nobody was going to see it. But anyway, so about 2013, he started thinking that he wanted to do something with that footage, and he reached out to Nancy Jeffries, as you said, one of the main organizers and kind of a legend in the music business, having done things like she was at the head of Bob Marley Music for a while, and has been like an A&R person for a lot of labels before that. So he reached out to her and said, because she was the only surviving member of the organizers at that point, everybody else had passed away. And she said, I think we ought to have a filmmaker involved. And I think that the right person to be involved is Augusta Palmer. So she called me in, and we went and looked at the footage, and then, but we couldn't quite agree on the direction for the film and exactly how to deal with it. So then, just sort of put it away in a drawer, but it kept kind of, I felt like tapping me on the shoulder and saying, this is important. And I thought, well, there's still that Channel 13 footage. So maybe I can make something with that. And so in 2016, I started making the film, and very luckily for me, Fat Possum Records had bought that footage, the beautiful 16 millimeter footage that Gene Rosenthal shot. And they were willing to license it for me. They did make their own film, which is called Memphis 69, which is out there on YouTube. And I recommend it to people because you can see longer performances in that.
I see. So it's more like a concert film, not a documentary, right?
Just a straight up concert film. There are no interviews.
And Fat Possum, we should say, right, is a Mississippi based, I think, right? Small, like sort of a boutique label that specializes in country blues musicians, and has done so for probably 25 years or something like that, right? Or maybe even longer.
Maybe even longer, I'm thinking. Yeah.
Right. A great label. Yeah.
And they became known for, releasing things like Junior Kimbrough and R.L. Burnside.
Right.
Yeah.
Latter day guys who are playing similar music to the guys that are that played at the Memphis Country Blues Society festivals.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Let me take a quick moment to do a couple quick things. I want to thank our co-promotion sponsor, which is the Ford Hall Forum at Suffolk University. Ford Hall is the nation's longest continually running public speaking forum, public lecture forum. And it's great to have Ford Hall Forum as a promotional partner at the Watch Club. And those of you who are watching, hopefully some of you came in through Ford Hall Forum's recommendation, and if so, welcome. And that leads me to the other thing I want to say, which is those of you who are watching live right now, if any of you have any questions for Dr. Palmer, you are more than welcome to just type them into the chat in YouTube or Facebook, and I will try to get to them and pose the questions myself. So go ahead and please do that if you'd like. And having said that, I'm going to continue my own questioning. And Augusta, the one of the main things I want to ask you about, you can see it in the trailer for the film. I love the artwork that you've put together, and you and your team, I assume, right? I love the way the footage is presented, like just sort of like the little glittering, like kind of looks like outsider art, some of it.
Yeah, the animation is made by Kelly Gallagher, who's a really wonderful filmmaker and animator in her own right. And so I felt really lucky to be able to work with her. And, since a lot of times what I was doing is putting together kind of these fragments that I found, because there was footage from '69, but I was also, relying on stills and concert programs and posters and things like that, so animating it was a great way, I think, to make it come to life.
Yeah, and I mean, you're looking at in most cases, black and white footage. I mean, the color footage is vibrant, like you said, but black and white footage is black and white footage. It looks older, right? And it makes it clearly makes it obvious that we're looking at something from decades ago. But the animation is just really gorgeously done. I wanted to give you an opportunity to give a shout out to. Sorry, what's it? Kelly, right? Is her name
Kelly Gallagher? Yeah.
And she's a filmmaker herself, like she's a
filmmaker. She's an animator, and a professor as well. So yeah, she's very, very talented. You can look on Vimeo and find Kelly Gallagher's Purple Riot, that's her company's name, and see some of her work. And
And did you know her from the academic world, or did somebody connect you with her?
I knew her because I had seen one of her films called Pearl Pistols at an experimental women's film festival, and I really, really, really loved that. And then I had seen that she had done some animation for some other films, like a great film called Everything is Photographable about Gary Winograd.
Oh yeah, she made that film?
No, she made the animation, just the animation.
Got it.
So got it, that I was like, oh, well, she'll do, animation, even though she also does her own thing.
That's a beautiful film too, actually. Yeah.
Yes. Sasha Waters, who's the director of that, is an old and very good friend.
Got it. Okay. Right. So to go back to Memphis, who is it in the film that says calls? I mean, I know that Memphians call the city sometimes the city of good abode, but somebody in particular is on camera saying that. Can you remember who that is?
That is Jamie Hatley, who is a writer and filmmaker who appears several times in the film. And yes, she says Memphis is the city of good abode, but for who? Which is, part of one of the film's central questions is.
Right. And can you just sort of describe what people from Memphis mean when they say that? I mean, I know that that's literally what Memphis means in Greek, right? I think. But what exactly does that mean? Like it's a good place to live, basically, right?
Yeah, and I think that would go along with another Memphis Country Blues song, "Walk Right In," which is originally recorded by Gus Cannon, but then was recorded as a folk song in the '60s by the Rooftop Singers. Is that right?
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yes. I think it's Rooftop Singers. Yeah.
Yeah, and so. This welcoming, wonderful.
We roll out the welcome mat, right?
Right. We'll roll out the welcome mat. But I think just in that song alone, which, like I said, was made by Gus Cannon, this black banjo player in the 1920s, and then suddenly becomes this folk song by white folk artists. That sort of tells you a lot about the history of Memphis music, and that the people making that music, like Gus Cannon, didn't always get the recognition that they deserved, or
not only did they not get
rarely got it. Yes.
Not only did they not get the recognition, but they very often went they were quote unquote undiscovered for decades, right? I mean, they were, a lot of them couldn't earn a living after the 30s or 40s doing what they did. So there's stories from there's a lot of Boston connections. The Cambridge folk scene of the 1960s was deeply connected. You probably know who Dick Waterman was, right? He died a few year or so ago, I think, and he became closely allied with some of the same musicians who played at the Memphis Blues Society festivals. But so there were folks like him who were helping to sort of go out on the road to find some of these guys. Skip James, who's in the film, for instance, who in some cases hadn't performed in decades and were working regular jobs to make ends meet. And so people just assumed, well, they disappeared, but they didn't disappear. They just were not living on stage, right?
Right, exactly. Well, there's a part in the film where I think there's a piece from my dad that's being read by Eric Roberts, who is really great, and I really appreciate him doing the voice of Bob Palmer, because since my dad's been dead for decades now, geez, hard to believe that. But where he's sort of saying, like, most of the players of this music from the 30s were presumed lost, and then someone says, and it's a quote from a blues man who was saying this actually in the 1960s in an interview, Joe Calicott. He said, "I ain't been lost. I've been right here the whole time." So I think that's, that's one of the central ideas that the film tries to get at, is that, when people do know about these players, there's just this white saviorist narrative of these. And it is true that the music hadn't been, paid enough attention to, and a lot of these players were not getting gigs, and these young white fans helped find them gigs and help them a lot. But at the same time, that wasn't just because of the way American society was, and to some extent still is, that wasn't just an easy, equal relationship.
Yeah. Do you know whether your mom or dad had any qualms about that? I mean, your father helped, he was one of the voices of the historians and writers and promoters. It's all of that, who helped some of these folks find a new audience, a new generation that was interested in their music. But you mentioned the phrase white savior, and I wonder if your father, or your mother for that matter, because she helped promote these shows, worried it to any extent about that. One thing that I will say about this film is that you pretty clearly steered a wide berth around your parents' involvement and put the focus on the musicians, right?
Yeah. I mean, and I think that would have been the focus that my dad wanted, and definitely still is the focus that my mom wanted, because I think my mom could see a little bit that, all of these young fans were in love with these musicians and loved their music so much. But at the same time, some of them, like Joe Calicott again, died in early 1969, basically because he was living in a, unheated house. I mean, that's what I've been told. So, so there are two sides to that. My dad definitely, I don't know whether I don't think he would have seen himself as a white savior, but I think he definitely did see, and I talked to him about the white people who came in and started making money off the blues.
Yeah.
And the idea that, I feel like there's been a little bit of a shift in this in the last couple of years, but if you went to a blues festival, even just a few years ago, almost all the audience would be white, and a lot of the players would be white too. And and I know that concerned him, and he didn't think that was the way things ought to be, because he thought that the people who made the music weren't always getting the credit for making it. Yeah.
Well, and you have some great voices from Memphis and elsewhere, mostly Memphis, I think. Speaking to some of this stuff, I mean, Robert Gordon is a writer I've admired. He wrote It Came from Memphis, I think, right? The book, which is a great book about the quirkier side of sort of Memphis's rock and roll culture. And then to go back to Jamie Hatley, who you mentioned earlier, her voice is really powerful. She talks about growing up a young Black woman in Memphis and feeling like she didn't want to have anything to do with this music because it represented an older version of her, her family that she didn't want to acknowledge. And now in, more recent years, she's come around to saying this is something to cherish, right? And she says it way better than that.
Yes, she's incredibly eloquent. I mean, she says that her hating the blues was like a fish hating water, which is a great line, I think. So she wrote a story, an essay in the Oxford American, which is a great magazine about Southern culture, called "Hating the Blues" in, I think, 2010.
Oh, okay. Is that where she came to you, or how you felt like she had to have a voice in this?
Yeah, that was definitely, I thought this is a really important voice to have in this film, because in that piece, she goes through the arc that she kind of goes through in the film too, of starting with saying she felt like the blues was old and poor, and she wanted to be separate from that. She wanted a different, it was all around her, but and she also says, like, seeing other people consume the blues, and I think she means mainly white people when she says that, also
no question,
made her less enthused about the blues. And it took her a while to go back and realize that the blues also puts the joy and the survival on record. That's another line of hers.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's right. That's great. Yeah. So like so much of our shared culture, your film touches to a pretty solid extent on the political and social issues of the time. You have the powerful image of the Memphis sanitation strikers, which is the reason Dr. King was in Memphis in 1968. And the strikers are all wearing the sandwich boards that say "I am a man," which is obviously a very much of an iconic image from the civil rights movement, and that happened in Memphis. So, you want to talk about, like, to what extent you were determined to make sure that you were making some kind of a social statement about the civil rights era, in addition to showcasing this, musical sort of renaissance, and to what extent was it just sort of like it was in the air, so you had to address it?
Well, I was pretty intent on that from very close to the beginning, because the work that my dad did on the blues, that's kind of a legacy that I've inherited, and it's always so great to talk to people like you who told me that you really loved his book Deep Blues and things like that, and it's often when people first get interested in the blues, it might be one of the first things that they read, and so I think it was important to me to kind of address what does that whole cultural current of the blues revival in the 60s mean at this point, in the ways that we think about race and talk about race now, which of course were not the ways that it could be talked about at that point. Yeah, so I thought that was very crucial from the beginning to try and get that.
So I mentioned Summer of Soul. I said, for those folks who maybe haven't had a chance to watch your film yet, but have seen Summer of Soul because it got so much attention a couple of years ago when it won the Academy Award, and rightfully so. It's about the Harlem, what was it called? Just the Harlem Music Fest. I forget what it was called, actually. The Harlem Music Festival.
I think so.
Something like that, right? In 1969, and this footage was supposedly basically buried away in somebody's attic or something. And Questlove, the musician, was part of a team that resurrected the footage and made this incredible film. So you were already underway making your film when that happened, and that was a little bit of a cultural phenomenon that, that footage from, a festival from 50 years ago won the Academy Award for documentary filmmaking. I can't imagine that you were thinking like, oh, that's great for me. Like our film is going to get a little more attention because it's easy to say that if you like that, you're going to like this too. Right.
Yeah. I mean, I was definitely excited to see that film come out and see, I think the things that stick with me about that film, in addition to the great musical performances, are things like how the film talks about the moon race, and that's just like not and gives a Black audience's perspective on the moon race, which is not something that mainstream media in America has talked about.
Yes.
That there were a lot of people in America who could have used that money for other things like eating, whatever. I'm not like that. That's in the past, and the moon race happened, and so forth.
There's still money being spent in places
in places where we don't want it to be spent, or there's certainly a lot of differences about where money should be spent. So I was really excited that film came out and really was a new voice and a new kind of music documentary. Yeah.
Right. There's who's the gentleman, one of the musicians who tells the story about, I wrote this line down because it was so great, but I don't remember which scene it was in the film. The guy tells a younger person, when you're driving you're not just driving for yourself, you're driving for the other person too, meaning you take care of the other person on the road, right? Like, not the other person in your car. So you're driving, but you're also being careful about not, jeopardizing somebody else, right? And it's such a great life lesson, right? Who tells that story?
So Kenny Brown tells that story in the film about Joe Calicott, who's the person who said the line, "Drive for yourself and drive for the other fellow."
Oh, that's right. Yeah, and he's the guy who said, I didn't think I liked this stuff at all until I met this guy, and he was such a great gentleman, right?
Yes. Yeah. And Kenny was living in rural Mississippi and kind of suspicious of these long-haired white hippies who are coming looking for a guy named Joe Calicott, which he thought sounded like a made-up name. So he was kind of standing in the background when they were talking to his mom, wondering if he should get the shotgun out. Luckily, no one was harmed. But anyway, and Kenny started hearing Joe Calicott play, and then Joe became his teacher and his friend, and music as well as driving for the other fellow too. Yeah.
But they were neighbors who didn't really interact with each other until these other guys came looking for Joe Calicott, and then Kenny ended up becoming really close with Joe in the last days of his life, right? And obviously 50 years later, he's still talking about it and the lesson that he learned from Joe, right?
Yeah, and Kenny also played a lot with R.L. Burnside and has his own blues festival in Mississippi called the Hill Country Picnic. So there was definitely a way in which these young blues fans driving out into Mississippi, sometimes with New York plates, which probably wasn't a great thing in Mississippi at that point. They drew attention of the white people who were there, who might have been living right alongside someone like Joe Calicott, but didn't really know about him or his music, or certainly didn't know that he'd recorded in the I guess the early 30s, I think, for Joe Calicott. So yeah.
Well, it's a beautiful moment in a beautiful film. There's lots of other moments like that in this film. I can't recommend it enough. So hopefully we're getting a few more folks to watch it if they haven't already. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me about this, Augusta. It's been nice to get to know you on the platform here. And we're just going to take a quick moment to thank our sponsor, and then we'll see you on the other side. We'll see you next month in the Watch Club. And thanks again, Dr. Palmer.
Thanks so much for having me. My pleasure. Really enjoyed it.